Hello, people. It's Perky Perkins back with another science fiction short story for you. This one's kind of long. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to get it all on. Welcome, fellow travelers in space and time, to another story from beyond the known world. The title of this story is The Pandora Project. My name is Jones, Jonah Jones. My mission was to investigate the Pandora Project. The project was named after Dr. Pandora, a brilliant but somewhat eccentric research scientist. The project was marked top secret. I peeled back the seal of the file and received my instructions regarding the location of the Pandora Project. The next day I packed my bags and headed for a place on the map marked only as Hidden Valley. After a long trip down a secluded country road, I arrived at the complex. I was greeted at the gate by a dogged-faced guard armed with a shotgun. His nameplate said Mr. Fido, P-H-I-D-O. Up above on the high gate that surrounded the complex was a sign that said, Authorized personnel only. The guard looked at my picture identification and gruffly motioned me to follow him. We climbed a grassy knoll and arrived at the front door of the complex. Standing in the doorway of the complex was a small, wiry old gentleman with a flowing shock of white hair. He shook my hand enthusiastically and said, Come in, Mr. Jones. We have been expecting you. I am Dr. Pandora, and this is my assistant, Miss Winnie. Behind the doctor stood a tall, raw-boned young woman with an elongated face and dangling arms hanging well below her waist. She reminded me of a young filly about to bolt for the pasture. Miss Winnie curtsied awkwardly and made a little Winnie-like laugh. I thought to myself Miss Winnie was quite well named. Dr. Pandora said, Winnie will take your bags. Miss Winnie picked up my bags as though they were as light as a feather and disappeared inside the doorway. Dr. Pandora said, I trust you had a good trip. I said, except for that dusty country road, everything was fine. The doctor said, we were just sitting down to supper. Won't you join us? I readily pulled up a chair. Miss Winnie rejoined us and sat at one side of the table. Mr. Fido sat on the other side. The good doctor sat at the head of the table, and I sat at the other end of the table. Dr. Pandora said, perhaps a glass of wine? I said, a glass of wine would be fine, doctor. The good doctor poured each of us a large glass of wine. In the middle of the table was a large platter of roasted chicken, surrounded by smaller platters of potatoes and other vegetables. As I looked at the chicken, I rubbed my eyes and looked again. I thought I must be seeing double. The chicken appeared to have 4 legs instead of 2. Dr. Pandora noticed my expression and said, that's right, my friend. A 4-legged chicken. Our chickens are specifically bred to give more meat. Besides, it means less fighting over the drumstick. We both laughed. Winnie gave a Winnie-like laugh. Mr. Fido just made a low grumble. I took another sip of wine and said, a 4-footed chicken, what next? Dr. Pandora carved and passed the plates around. I noticed that Winnie took only a large salad topped off with carrots and apple slices. Dr. Pandora said, Miss Winnie is strictly a vegetarian. Apparently Fido was not. His plate had 2 chicken legs and no vegetables. I helped myself to the chicken, potatoes, squash, and plenty of tomatoes. Dr. Pandora said, how are the tomatoes, Mr. Jones? I wiped my mouth with a napkin and said, they're delicious, Dr. Pandora. The best I've ever had. They're so ripe and so juicy. The good doctor said, we grow all our own food here. They're fresh from the garden. Even the wine you are sipping is straight from our own vineyard. We are entirely self-sustaining. I ate with great gusto, which seemed to please the good doctor greatly. I couldn't help but notice that every time Dr. Pandora spoke, Winnie would give a little Winnie-like laugh. Every time I spoke, Mr. Fido would begin to grumble under his breath. When we had all eaten to our heart's content, Dr. Pandora suggested we adjourn to the study. We all pushed away from the table and headed for the study. All except Mr. Fido. He continued to gnaw on the chicken legs and growl under his breath. The walls of the study were lined with books of all kinds, books that looked like they had actually been read. I realized I was in the company of a learned man. In the corner of the room was a massive fireplace. A small bugle on a leather strap hung down over the top of the fireplace. Several other knickknacks adorned the mantelpiece. In the center of the room was a large mahogany desk. Several easy chairs were scattered around the desk. Dr. Pandora threw another log onto the small fire and motioned me toward one of the easy chairs. He took a sip of wine and said, "Tell me, my young friend, how are things in the outside world?" I took another sip of my wine and said, "The same as usual, Doctor. Wars and rumors of war. People are always marching for something. There's always another noble cause. Things change, but they never really change." Dr. Pandora gave me a wizened look and said, "Yes, my young friend, I remember it well. Such is human nature. Throughout the course of human history, men have always spoken about brotherhood and friendship. But in reality, they have always struggled to dominate one another. Man against man and nation against nation. People always fear anyone who looks different, or speaks a different language, or worships a different god, or no god at all." He added, "Perhaps that is why I enjoy my life here so much in Hidden Valley. I have time to do my work without interruption." I cleared my throat and said bravely, "Just what is your work, Dr. Pandora?" The good doctor looked at me and said, My work is the work of science. The beauty of science, my young friend, is that science is cumulative. The discovery of one scientific wonder often leads to the discovery of other scientific wonders. Man on the moon, solar power, the silicon chip, flowers that bloom in the desert. The miracles of science are endless. The good doctor said, "Someday science may even find a cure for the common cold." We laughed, and I took another sip of wine. The doctor lowered his tone and said, "Perhaps one day science will even be able to change the very nature of man himself. There will be no more war, or fear, or hatred. No more war. Think of that, my young friend. A world full of peace and tranquility." I said, "Perhaps, Dr. Pandora, science will actually find a cure for the common cold someday, but I doubt that science will ever be able to change human nature itself." Dr. Pandora smiled and said with a wry grin, "We shall see, my young friend. We shall see." Then the good doctor put his hand on my shoulder and said, "But enough talk for one day. You must be tired after your long trip." I stifled a yawn and my eyelids grew heavy. I said, "I must admit all that good food and wine has made me feel rather drowsy." Dr. Pandora motioned to Winnie, who had been nodding approvingly at everything the good doctor had to say. The good doctor said, "Winnie will show you to your room." Then he added, "Tomorrow, my young friend, tomorrow, I will show you the greatest scientific wonder of all." I followed Winnie as she led me awkwardly down a long and winding corridor, still thinking to myself, I wonder what Dr. Pandora has in store for me tomorrow. Perhaps tomorrow I'll find out what the Pandora Project really is at last. My room was spare but neat and clean. At one end of the room was a small bed and wash basin. To one side, a chest of bureau drawers. At the other end, a small desk overlooking a large bay window. I unpacked my bags and placed my briefcase down on the small desk. I stretched my neck for just a moment and looked out the window at what appeared to be a lovely idyllic scene. The evening was just going down over the horizon. I could still see the shadowy figure of a horse gamboling out on the distant pasture. The horse stopped for a moment. It reared up on its hind legs. Then it disappeared from view. I said to myself, for a moment, that horse appeared to be almost human. I paused and said it must have been the shadows. First a four-legged chicken and now a two-legged horse. I laughed to myself and pulled down the covers on my bed. My head barely touched the pillow when I fell asleep listening to the baying of a hound somewhere off in the distance. The next morning I arrived with notebook in hand. Dr. Pandora said, "Did you have a good night's sleep, Mr. Jones?" I said, "I slept just fine, doctor. Your accommodations were quite comfortable." I decided not to mention the incident with the horse, or with the baying hound for that matter. I assumed the dog was probably a watchdog of some kind. We had a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs and milk and cereal. Then Dr. Pandora said, "I promised you I would show you the greatest wonder of all today. Come, let me show you." He gestured, and I followed the good doctor down the hallway, he said. Suffice it to say, it was not the splitting of the atom that was man's greatest achievement. It was the splitting of the DNA molecule. I said, "You mean genetics?" The good doctor said, "Yes, my young friend, genetic engineering to be precise. The world will never be the same." I said to myself, so that was it. The Pandora Project was experiments in genetic engineering. I followed the good doctor through a small opening in the back of the house, and we emerged into a veritable Garden of Eden. Dr. Pandora said, "Welcome to my garden. It is rather beautiful, don't you think?" I nodded my head in agreement. Hoses were strewn everywhere among various plants and flowers. The air was filled with intoxicating aromas. A string of grapevines hung over the border of the garden. At the end of the garden, I could see Winnie watering some of the plants in her usual awkward manner. Dr. Pandora said, those tomatoes and squash and the other vegetable you had last night all came from this garden. They are all the results of genetic engineering." I said, "What about the chicken, Dr. Pandora? Was the chicken also the result of genetic engineering?" He said, "Of course. The chicken was also genetically engineered. There is nothing to be worried about. Genetically engineered food is perfectly safe and is, as you can see, quite tasty. Genetic engineering allows the food to stay ripe much longer and to be disease resistant. Think of it, my young friend. Food to feed the world. Crops that last longer and cannot be wiped out by disease." He tweaked his shirt and said, "This shirt I have on is made from cotton. Cotton that is completely herbicide resistant. The cotton shirt that I have on and the milk you had this morning, all genetically engineered. Transgenic cows produce more milk with more protein. Again, food to feed the world. Remember, the more we feed, the more we have to feed." Dr. Pandora opened up the door to a small building located at the end of the garden. He said, "This is my laboratory." I looked around at a room full of mysterious liquids and bubbling beakers. A large microscope sat in the corner of a crowded table. There was Mr. Fido once again, sitting on a stool in the corner of the room. He was reading a newspaper and gnawing on another large bone. The shotgun was resting at his side. As soon as he saw me, he put the newspaper down and started growling under his breath. As he picked the newspaper back up in front of his face, I could clearly see the newspaper was upside down. Dr. Pandora noticed the expression on my face and said, do not mind Mr. Fido. He takes his guard duties very seriously." The good doctor then proceeded to the far end of the room and reached into a small refrigerated compartment. Slowly, he withdrew a small black box. He patted the small black box several times as he spoke. He said, "What if I were to tell you that the answer to all the world's problems were right here in this little black box?" He said, "This little black box contains embryos of all kinds of animals. Genetic engineering has made it possible for these embryos to be used for the good of all mankind. Human cells mixed with cow eggs stripped of their DNA can create embryonic stem cells that have the ability to transform into any kind of human tissue and eventually organs of any type. It is now possible to mix cells from different species. A swab from my cheek and a new hybrid is born. Think of it, a living being of mixed species. Their organs can be used for all kinds of diseases. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, Parkinson's, and a host of other diseases. Transgenic pigs with human organs could be used for human organ transplants. All I could think of at the time was a pig standing on two legs, handing out a business card. The good doctor continued, even human cloning will be possible in the near future. Patients will not need to worry about organ donors or their body rejecting a new organ. The cell of the clone will be identical. Cells could be put into a dish to grow heart muscles, bone, or cartilage, a human parts department. A human parts department. I shook my head in amazement. Dr. Pandora was right. Splitting the DNA molecule was the greatest scientific achievement of all. The brilliance of the good doctor amazed me. The good doctor continued. He said, it may even be possible to eliminate disease entirely. Therapy for diseases. Think of it. Therapy for diseases based on nuclear transfer may eliminate genetic diseases of all kinds. Heart diseases, diabetes, epilepsy, birth defects, childhood diseases such as cystic fibrosis, all curable by genetic engineering. We might even be able to find the gene responsible for cancer or the gene responsible for aging. People living longer and happier lives. The good doctor said the miracles of science have made the utopian world possible. Man can now take his destiny into his own hands. Think of it, my young friend. Food to feed the world. No more disease or starvation or war. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, we may even be able to breed out the instinct for war, to change human nature itself. He said, now you know what the Pandora Project is, the Human Genome Project. I nodded enthusiastically. He added, now you know why my work is so important. The world is waiting. The next day, as I sat in my room writing my report, I marveled at the possibilities of Dr. Pandora's work. The implication of Dr. Pandora's work were truly monumental. Food to feed the world. No more disease. World peace. People living longer and happier lives. Dr. Pandora was right. The world will never be the same. For the next few weeks, Dr. Pandora showed me miracle after miracle from the world of science. My pen fairly trembled with excitement. Then one day a curious thing happened. As I was writing a report in my room, I found a dead mouse. A dead mouse with a human ear on its back. It was then that I began to think about the true implications of the Pandora Project. A chill went down my spine. My mind flashed back to the kudzu project. Kudzu was a vine that was planted to prevent erosion of the soil. It also enriched the soil due to nitrogen-fixing bacteria that lived on its roots. When it was plowed under, corn was planted on the same ground, the yield from the corn crop was much larger. The kudzu project was designed to bring about a genetically improved strain of kudzu vine, but the kudzu vines turned out to be so disease-resistant that they ran amok and wiped out all the other plants and grasses in the area. Nobody had seen the true implications of the kudzu project. Could it be the same for the Pandora Project? I began to think about other possible implications of the Pandora Project. Could animal diseases be transmitted to human beings? Could a hybrid animal used for organ transplants introduce a killer disease to humanity? What if the disease was hidden? The disease might be benign to the animal carrier, but not to the human being. A whole new series of killer viruses might be transmitted from animals to men. And what about abnormalities in the animals themselves? Will animal hybrids and eventually human clones be born with major birth defects, gross physical distortions, perhaps fatal abnormalities? And what about the clones themselves? Don't clones have rights as human beings? We might just be letting something out of the bottle that we could not put back into the bottle. The next day I confronted the good doctor in his laboratory. He was bent over a microscope studying some slides. I said, "I found a dead mouse in my room, doctor. A dead mouse with a human ear on its back." The good doctor straightened up stiffly with a hand on his back and said, Yes, we have mice." I said, "You don't understand, doctor. This mouse had a human ear on its back." Dr. Pandora flashed me a toothy smile and said, "Animal modules are necessary, my young friend. Animal modules are a necessary step in human gene transfer and other experiments. That particular mouse was used in a tissue engineering experiment. I created an ear-like scaffolding in my laboratory. The scaffolding consisted of porous, biodegradable polymer fiber. Then I distributed human cartilage throughout the form and implanted the prototype ear on the back of a hairless mouse that was specifically bred to lack an immune that might reject the human tissue. The mouse nourished the ear as the cartilage grew to replace the fiber. I have been able to grow liver, skin, cartilage, bone, ureters, heart valves, tendons, intestines, blood vessels, and breast tissue, all on such polymers as I have described to you." He said, "I used other mice for experiments in germline changes. By improving the genes that pass from one generation to another, I have been able to create permanent inherited changes in mice. We can now eliminate unwanted traits and create traits that are more desirable. Germline changes may be able to eliminate genetic diseases in human beings. We may be able to create better designed human beings, people that are healthier, more intelligent, better looking, perhaps more peaceful." I said, "Your accomplishments are truly remarkable, Dr. Pandora, but do you think it's wise? Do you think it's wise for man to take human evolution into his own hands?" The good doctor gave me a quizzical look and said, "Human evolution is a matter of adaptation. Adaptation is necessary for survival." I said, "I know, doctor, but perhaps we're moving too quickly. Dr. Pandora's shock of white hair seemed to stand on end like an unruly mane. Then he said, "The world will not wait. It may already be too late. Lives are at stake. Contagious diseases are running rampant. We live in a world of want. People are starving to death. We must act now." I said, "But what if something goes wrong? Perhaps the risk is too great." He said, "Risk? There is always risk. Pasteur, Salk, Fleming, they all took risks. Every time a new vaccine or extract is developed, there is a risk. But think of the rewards. A new and better world." The doctor's eyes took on a wild look, and he said, "My experiments must continue. It was apparent to me that the good doctor's zeal had outrun his humanity. As I listened to the good doctor speak, I couldn't help but notice how he had changed since the first day I met him. When I first met Dr. Pandora, he was bright-eyed and good-humored. Now his whole appearance had taken on a disheveled look. His face had grown thin and gaunt looking, and his toothy smile had grown even more prominent. His hair hung down onto his back, and his whole manner had taken on a feeling of agitation and impatience. He was like a different person. And then there was the matter of Winnie and Fido. Neither Winnie nor Fido had spoken a single word since they arrived at the complex. There was nodding and laughing and grumbling, but no actual talking. Winnie seemed to spend most of her time trying to awkwardly balance herself as she went about her daily business, while Mr. Fido spent most of his time gnawing on chicken bones and growling under his breath. I began to feel increasingly isolated. For the next few days, I sat in my room writing my report, but I just couldn't get that dead mouse out of my mind. I said to myself, a mouse with a human ear on its back, what next? A man with a mouse on his back? A dog man? A horse woman? Over many years of evolution, and now this. I recalled the original Pandora of Greek mythology. Pandora had a box which the gods told her never to open. But Pandora's curiosity was too strong. She finally raised the lid. All the vices and sins and diseases and troubles of the world flew out from the box. Pandora shut the lid as quickly as she could, but it was too late. Only one thing remained in the box. That thing was hope. I feared that Dr. Pandora's little black box might also let loose all the evils of the world. It might be best if he closed it before it was too late, while hope was still in the box. I resolved to leave as soon as possible. I packed my bags that night. The next morning I headed for the front door. I stopped to say goodbye to Dr. Pandora, but as I entered the study, I laid eyes on the strangest sight I had ever seen. There, sitting in Dr. Pandora's chair, was a creature I can only describe as half man and half fox. He flashed a pair of beady eyes and sharp white teeth. I could see a long white mane running down his back. Dr. Pandora was nowhere in sight. It was as I had feared. Something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. Evidently, the mouse was only the beginning. Dr. Pandora had been making men into animals. The fox man turned toward me and said, "You will not be permitted to leave. You know too much. You are a threat to the entire project. The experiments must go on." He motioned to Fido to move toward the front door. I instinctively flung my suitcase at Fido and burst out the front door. I ran for my life as fast as I could toward the grassy knoll. As I looked behind me, I could see a horse and a dog chasing after me. Behind the horse and the dog was a foxman waving a bugle and yelling, "Tally-ho! Tally-ho! The hunt is on! The thrill of the hunt! The thrill of the hunt!" I could hear the baying of the hound. As I looked again, I could see it was not a horse or a dog. It was Winnie and Fido down on all fours. It was then that I realized the terrible truth. It was then that the shadowy figure I had seen in the pasture and the howling dog in the distance suddenly made sense. Dr. Pandora was not making men into animals. He was making animals into men. Winnie and Fido were not human at all. They were hybrid animals, bioengineered animals. The foxman shouted, run into ground! Run into ground! He knows too much! Run into ground!" I could hear the thundering hoofs and the baying of the hound. Soon Fido would be nipping at my heels. As I approached the grassy knoll, I tripped and fell. I covered my face with my hands and prepared for the worst. I heard the foxman say, "The shock will prevent any pain." There was a moment of silence, and then a shot rang out. I warily uncovered my head and looked up. The foxman was lying on the ground. Winnie and Fido were nowhere in sight. They had apparently been frightened off by the sound of the gunshot. The foxman had shot himself. The shotgun was lying at his side. As I moved nearer to the foxman, his features grew clearer. I could see a shock of white hair running down his backside. It was then that I realized the truth. The foxman was Dr. Pandora himself. Something had gone terribly wrong. He had become a victim of his own experiments. I lifted his head up gently, and he said, "I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it, my young friend. It was the candidine extract, genetic fox hormone. It overtook me. I was taking it for back pain." I said to myself, fox hormone? No wonder the good doctor's hair really was turning into a mane. The teeth and the wild eyes were the real thing. The fox hormone had completely overpowered the good doctor. Yet with one last monumental effort, his human side had won out over his animal side. The shot had only grazed Dr. Pandora's head. I carried the good doctor back to the entrance of the complex. Within a few days, the wound had healed and the fox hormone had worn off. The good doctor turned to me and said with a rather sheepish grin, "You were right, my young friend. Some things are better off left undone. I can only hope that Winnie and Fido are happy with their newfound freedom." I nodded my head in agreement and said, "The next time you want to make a better world, Dr. Pandora, just work on a cure for the common cold." We both laughed heartily as we had once before. The next day I said adieu to Dr. Pandora. As I started back down that bumpy country road that I had traveled once before, I said to myself, perhaps someday Dr. Pandora's dream would really come true. Food to feed the world, no more disease, people living longer and happier lives, world peace. Perhaps someday the marvels of science will make the utopian world possible. But until then, we'll make the utopian world possible. But until then, we can only hope that man will use caution when dealing with human life. That's the story for today, people. Until we meet again.